Good afternoon, Bermuda, and a pleasant Monday to you. Today, the government joins with all of Bermuda to mourn the passing of the latest victim of COVID-19. We pray for their family and their friends, and we continue to pray for those who are currently battling this virus, whether they be at home or whether they be in our hospital. It is important to note and remember that COVID-19 is not a joke. It has forced many families to say goodbye to loved ones before their time. It has caused economic stress, personal stress, and mental distress to many Bermudians. And it has left many without work, especially those in our tourism and service sectors. It is clear that this disease and this virus is no laughing matter. Yet this weekend, while a vast majority of Bermudians left their homes only when necessary, far too many treated it as a joke, with reports of gatherings, parties, and certain businesses not enforcing social distancing, and also a stabbing. To say that I am disappointed is an understatement. I have spoken with the Minister of National Security, and enforcement will be stepped up, and penalties will be strictly enforced. The penalties for violating the regulations include a $10,000 fine and/or a term of imprisonment. And to be clear, my job is not to criminalize anyone, and I do not wish to criminalize any more persons in this country than we have already done so. However, I must balance that between my responsibility of keeping the country safe during a pandemic. Tomorrow, the Cabinet will meet, and amongst our matters of discussion will be whether there is a need to refine the existing regulations and also the discussion of implementation of further economic relief measures for residents and business owners impacted by COVID-19. Specifically authorizing a one-time withdrawal from private occupational pensions. Now, I am joined today by the Minister of Health, the Minister of National Security, and the Minister of Labor, Community Affairs, and Sport. And before I go on to the other ministers, we will begin our press conference today with an update from the Minister of Health on the work being done by her team to protect the health and safety of Bermuda. Minister.
Thank you, Premier. Good afternoon. Between yesterday and today, there were 127 test results received by the Ministry of Health, and none were positive for COVID-19. Bermuda has 115 total confirmed positive cases. Their status is as follows. There are 54 active cases, of which 38 persons are under active public health monitoring and 16 persons are hospitalized. A total of 54 have now recovered, and the total deceased remains at 7. The average age of all of our confirmed positive cases is 59 years of age, and the age range for all of our positive cases is from 18 to 95 years. The age of persons hospitalized ranges between 57 and 91 years, and the average age is 76, and the age range of deceased cases is 57 to 91. As of today, we have tested 142 care home residents and 198 staff members from 6 different care homes. Of all those tested, 299 have come back negative, with 41 positive. With respect to testing at the 2 care homes which had outbreaks, at Matilda Smith Williams Rest Home, less than 50% of those that tested positive were asymptomatic, whilst at Westmeath, 90% were asymptomatic. With respect to the first air bridge, there were 11 positive cases. All were asymptomatic. Quarantined passengers of the latest air bridge are being tested this week prior to their departure. I give these details reluctantly, notwithstanding the public's right to know and the media's desire to report granular details. However, I remind you all that given the size of our community and the small number of people that we are referring to, it is all too easy for individuals to easily become identifiable. This is a reportable disease, just as measles or HIV. We have to treat the information with the same level of sensitivity because it is about our friends, our neighbors, and our loved ones. According to the worldometer.info, Bermuda is now in the top 12 countries for testing per capita. Unfortunately, due to our demographic characteristics with an older population and higher rate of chronic diseases, we do have a population with higher risks due to COVID-19. And this is reflected in our mortality rate, which is why preventative measures are even more important in a community like ours with so many people who are clinically vulnerable. However, I want to emphasize that even if you have been tested and you test negative, that doesn't mean that you cannot get the virus. It just means that you do not have it at that point in time. To stay COVID-free, you must practice physical distancing, wash your hands, and wear a face mask. Having a test does not mean you can stop the preventative measures. Last week, we introduced the Health IQ, and the Health Council's simple tool, which is an online tool that will help us as a community in our efforts to progress from phase 1 through phase 4 of COVID-19 restrictions. In the past 2 days, the Health Council has received over 1,000 unique patient reports with 2 potential COVID cases on Health IQ. Each member of the public is encouraged to go to the healthiq.bm and enter information about how they are feeling, in addition to tracking our community's health status and symptoms that may be associated with COVID-19. The tool will also help our public health teams to identify risks and resources needed to keep our communities safe. As I wrap up, I want to thank the operators of the COVID helpline who have fielded more than 500 calls from the members of the public since it began in March of 2019. This is a resourceful and dedicated team that have been assisting the public throughout this difficult period of rapid change, and I salute the helpline workers for their vital role that they play and that they continue to play for our community. And finally, as this month is International Nurses Month, I want to thank all of Bermuda's nurses for their hard work and sacrifices made, particularly over the past few months, which have been tough for nurses and healthcare professionals alike. Please know that we appreciate you, and I appreciate you. And the entire community is grateful for your sacrifice and your service. Thank you, Premier.
Thank you very much, Minister of Health. Before Minister Kane speaks, I would like to remind all persons that screening tests of essential workers continues at Southside. If you are a healthcare professional, work as a private home health aide, work in a grocery store or restaurant, or if you are a government worker, you should go to the drive-through testing facility at Southside, which is located in the parking lot of the old White's supermarket. Appointments are available daily between 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. Drop-ins, though discouraged, may also be accommodated. Please go to the government website, coronavirus.gov.bm, for the link to book your appointment. Now, the Minister of National Security will provide details on the elevated enforcement measures stemming from the incidents over the weekend and additional information regarding the Ministry of National Security. Minister Kane.
Thank you, Premier. Good evening, Bermuda. This weekend, like the Premier, I was disturbed at some of the behavior that I saw of people simply not following the guidance and protocols that were set out in the regulations. People were not observing physical distancing. Some people were not wearing face covering, and some were gathered in crowded areas in a few instances. This weekend, the Bermuda Police Service and the Bermuda Regiment will be deployed across the island this week to ensure that the regulations and the guidelines will be followed. There will be enhanced enforcement. I had the opportunity at our EMO meeting today to sit down and to talk with the Commissioner of Police and the Acting Commanding Officer of the Bermuda Regiment. We shared the nuances of making sure that we are not heavily handed, but also making sure that the rules are followed. We discussed that we must have strong enforcement. Both men indicated that their organizations will do their level best to make sure that we are following the rules. as it relates to this past weekend. The Bermuda Police Service and the Bermuda Regiment, they are deployed across the island. Over the weekend, community advisory points were set up at key public space locations, and they provided guidance and advice with reference to the amended regulations. Joint patrols took place at beaches and parks to ensure that physical distancing was taking place. Several visits were made to business premises, including to restaurants, to monitor compliance. The BPS road policing units was also out monitoring traffic, and in certain cases, speeding and drinking was monitored. As I noted earlier, the BPS is now investigating complaints with reference to non-compliant behavior. Please note that this type of behavior puts our communities at risk of COVID-19 transfer. We do not want to criminalize people, but enforcement action will be taken if people do not follow the regulations. Again, the maximum fine is one of $10,000 or imprisonment for up to 6 months. As a reminder, we encourage anyone to report any breaches of the regulation via the complaints on the BPS website. However, in case of a serious breach, please contact the police on 211. Over the weekend, the Royal Bermuda Regiment patrolled 48 public areas over the weekend and verbally engaged with 891 people. Most of the gatherings that were seen were clusters of 3 to 7 persons. There were some larger groups that were identified, and the Royal Bermuda Regiment politely enforced the physical distancing requirements. Additionally, patrols were extended to include permitted businesses and restaurants. I think it important to take a moment to remind the public of the guidance for restaurant in Section 12 of the Emergency Powers Regulations. Number 1, opening hours are from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. Collections of orders only. This means takeout services, no eating in. Only one customer is allowed to pick up the takeout meal. Ideally, customers should call in their order and pay with the order by credit card to save hand-to-hand transactions. Delivery services are also running from restaurants. There are also some gas stations which offer food and takeout services. For the avoidance of doubt, the guidelines for food service aspect of these establishments should follow the food takeout protocols for restaurants. So again, opening hours from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. only, collection of orders only. People should order ahead and collect their takeout service. Only one customer at a time shall be permitted to enter the premises to collect and or pay for the order. Dine-in services are prohibited. A restaurant may make delivery services to customers. Self-service offerings such as coffee, soup, hot foods, buffets should not be allowed. Strict physical distancing must be maintained between staff members. Strict physical distancing must be maintained between customers. Management should also monitor staff to ensure regular and adequate hand washing and strict adherence to personal hygiene in order to avoid cross-contamination and cross-infection. Turning to the government-managed quarantine facilities. There are currently a total of 97 persons in the government quarantine facility. Today, 7 people were tested at the quarantine facility. On Thursday, another 80 people will be tested. Lastly, turning to the Customs Department. The Hamilton Customs House is closed to walk-in customers until further notice. Customs no longer accept paper customs declaration. Customs declarations may be submitted by the normally followed electronic means. Number 1, the Customs Automated Process, or the CAPS, using the Customer File Transfer Protocol, or FTP, or by using the Customs Web Trader Service. Scans of supporting documentation should be only sent in response to a customs query. You must apply for a CAPS ID number if you're making an electronic submission. For more information on how to get a CAPS ID number or how to apply for one, visit the government portal. Customers who are unable to make electronic submissions themselves should use a customs clearing agent to make the customs declaration for them. Duty payment should be made by bank-to-bank transfer. For guidance on how to make a bank-to-bank transfer, you can also visit the government portal. Again, the link will be shared following today's press briefing. Anyone who has any customs-related inquiries can email customs@gov.bm. Premier, before I finish, I would like to thank the Department of Financial Assistance. I see them every day and the hundreds of people that are waiting outside the building, and I just want to give them a special thanks. And also to Mr. and Mrs. B, who donated just over 150 bags filled with toiletries. Please note that those bags were donated to needy families across our island.
Thank you very much, Minister. In a follow-up to comments to which the Minister has given, I have been asked by a few persons online to explain what gatherings of no more than 10 means. It's rather simple. It means that no more than 10 persons can be in the same place. And if there are 10 or less persons in the same place, they must be, according to the rules, exercising physical distancing. 6 feet or more apart, and each person must make sure that they wash their hands frequently with no shaking, hugging, or kissing. It's important to reduce transmission risk that everyone at the gathering should wear a mask for the entire time that they are together, especially if they are not from the same household. Having said that, if you don't have to gather, then you shouldn't. And our goal, of course, is to reduce the amount of persons in the country who contract this virus. As a country, we will not be healthy or wealthy if we treat this virus as a joke. I was appalled to see photos of persons that I know live with seniors this weekend to be gathered in groups with others who were not wearing masks. Not only are you putting yourself at risk, you are putting your family at risk, and that is not wise. There is a lot of talk about masks, and I've had people sending me old social media videos about masks not being recommended by the international organizations. The fact is that this is a new virus and information changes quickly. The old information is that masks were not recommended to be worn. That is old information, and all of the international bodies are now recommending that in cases where social distancing cannot be achieved, that you wear a mask. And as the Minister of Health has said on numerous occasions, you wear a mask to protect me, and I wear a mask to protect you. You also heard from the Minister of Health today that the vast majority of persons who were caught in our screening exercises, both at some of the rest homes and also on the air bridge flight, who tested positive were asymptomatic. What that means is that they did not have the traditional symptoms of a fever or a cough. They had no symptoms whatsoever. And so that is why it is important. And I heard people giving comments such as, the guidance does not say that people who are uninfected should wear masks. That is precisely the point. We don't know who may be infected. And the evidence shows that there are a large number of persons who are infected who do not know they have the virus and can transmit it to somebody else. That is the reason why, if you're in groups of persons, or, for instance, when you're entering buildings, you are required to wear a mask so you do not spread this disease to other persons unwillingly. This is not something that we are implementing because we think sets a good fashion style. We are implementing it because it is necessary to save lives. On another note, we continue to get queries and concerns about landlord and tenant issues. I just want to repeat some guidance which was previously given by the government. We are encouraging landlords to assist tenants experiencing financial hardship as a result of COVID-19, and we ask that landlords consider realistically assessing their own financial situation and obligations as to how you may be able to assist your tenant, making sure that you speak with each tenant individually if you're renting to more than one tenant to assess each tenant's situation on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the current ability of a tenant to pay and the history of that tenant's payment record. Landlords are also requested to have compassion for tenants who do not have family support on the island and are not eligible for financial assistance but may be able to claim unemployment benefits and may have been late in receiving those particular benefits. We certainly encourage tenants who have the ability to pay their rent to please do so in accordance with their current rental agreement. If it comes time to you to go before the courts and it is shown that you have had income and were able to pay your rent, then I'm quite certain that these courts will look at your situation in a less favorable perspective. Changes to a lease must be documented and acknowledged by both parties on the agreement reached, including whether any reduction in rent is temporary or if the rent reduction is to be deferred to a later time when the tenant may have more of an ability to pay. In addition, any agreement reached to amend payment terms should be reviewed on a monthly basis, valid up to 90 days. Working in collaboration with the Real Estate Division of the Bermuda Chamber of Commerce, the COVID-19 Landlord-Tenant Addendum Agreement Guidelines, as well as a COVID-19 Renter Relief Form, has been developed to support discussions around adjusting rent payments during these uncertain times, and it can be found on the government website, coronavirus.gov.bm, and just click on COVID-19 forms. The unemployment benefit program has had its successes, yet we cannot celebrate until every single Bermudian that is eligible for this safety net has received the support they so desperately need. Today, Minister Fogo has joined us again to provide an update on the unemployment benefit program. Minister Fogo?
Thank you, Premier. Good evening to the listening and viewing public. Last week, some 2,500 applicants received their unemployment benefit for the first time and were paid along with those that had been paid previously and were still eligible. The total paid last week was $7.2 million. Since the launch of the fund on the 25th of March 2020, some 7,500 have been paid, and now that takes the benefit up to approximately $15 million in total. My colleagues and I, on a daily basis, hear heart-wrenching stories of Bermudian families who are struggling to put food on the table. And that doesn't even take into account having to pay utility bills and other bills. I just want you to know that we hear you. We hear you, Bermudians. We hear you. The Minister of Finance last week amended the regulations for the unemployment benefit to expand those who qualify to include those self-employed persons who were not previously registered with the Office of the Tax Commissioner. They now apply for the benefit after registering with the Office of the Tax Commissioner and will be eligible for a benefit of $300 per week for up to 12 weeks. I am aware of the frustration of some who have applied and have not received their benefit. There are 92 persons from multiple government departments working to process outstanding payments, and they will keep working until all persons who are eligible receive the assistance they require. As mentioned last Monday, if you applied for the benefit on or before April 6th and at the end of last week had not received any benefit or been advised that you are ineligible, then you should contact the call center for assistance. We have updated the call center to ensure that calls are routed to the next available customer service representative. Please call the center numbers 2977-714 and 2977-716. Make these calls during normal business hours, and do know that system has been upgraded to handle the volume of calls. And I will just digress from what's written here for 2 seconds to say we are taking as many as 400 to 600 calls. It's being manned by about 15 people, and we are taking a volume of 400 to 600 calls every day. And on top of that, we are fielding about 800 emails, and there are 5 persons who are dedicated to looking at those 800 emails a day. It's not a week, it is a day. So the unemployment benefit form can be found at www.gov.bm for those still needing to fill it out. And emails with concerns can also be sent to the unemployment benefit at gov.bm so that we can attend to your assistance that you require. I do want to commend those businesses that have stood by the employees during this very difficult time. A number, despite having little or no income during the stay-in-place period, have kept their staff on the payroll and their employees' health insurance in place. We thank you. These companies have put their employees first, and I wish, on behalf of the government, to definitely highlight the gratitude to those companies for having done so. Finally, with the shelter in place ended, we are seeing some residents going back to work. If you are back at work and had applied for the unemployment benefit, then you must notify Workforce Development and can do so by email to the unemployment benefit at gov.bam. Include your name, your social insurance number, your date of birth, and the date that you began work, so that we can make the adjustments accordingly in our system. Bermuda, I just want to remind you, we are our brother's keeper, and we will get through this together. We will.
Thank you, Minister Fogo. The government has authorized Travel Edge to operate a second charter flight to bring Bermudians home from the United States. The flight will operate from Atlanta on May 15th if there is enough interest. Passengers on the flight will be required to quarantine in a government facility for 14 days at the rate of $100 per day on arrival in Bermuda. Travel Edge requires 90 confirmed passengers in any combination of inbound and outbound travel to make this work. If you are interested, you should contact Travel Edge at info@traveledge.bm. If you have previously registered your interest on the government website, we will ensure that you receive the information about this charter flight. This morning, the government expanded services that are available to the public. These services include the Transport Control Department, the Office of the Tax Commissioner, and ground floor cashiers in both the Government Administration Building and the Dame Lois Brown Evans Building. The Transport Control Department was open for most business today. While there were long lines at one point this morning, overall today went well at TCD. There was one element of confusion with respect to the collection of vehicle registrations by those persons who licensed their vehicle online while TCD was closed. Those who used the ETCD system and elected to have their items picked up versus them being mailed can collect their registration at the National Sports Center Pavilion. To assist with physical distancing, TCD is asking everyone to go to the pavilion using the same system used for grocery shopping days. So if your last name is A through F, your day is Monday and Thursday. G through Q, Tuesdays and Fridays. R through Z, Wednesdays and Saturdays. For those persons who wish to collect, whose last name is from R to Z, and wish to collect your registration on Saturday, please visit the T-City offices on North Street. Not the pavilion on the Saturday, but the other days, please go to the National Sports Center Pavilion. All customers going to T-City on North Street will be served on a first-come, first-served basis. However, it is important to know that you can avoid all lines by using the etcd.gov.bm website and choosing the option to have your vehicle registration mailed to you versus you picking it up. Also, to give an update on the delivery of mail, home delivery has been occurring every week, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. This will continue for the next few weeks. All post boxes are accessible to the public at this time. Starting tomorrow, parcels can be collected from the General Post Office on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Public access to government offices, however, will be limited, and there are a number of new procedures in place for anyone who has to go into a government office. Specific locations may have additional criteria in place, but the general terms are: before entering any government building, a government official requests that all persons have their body temperature taken with an infrared touchless thermometer. To enter government buildings, everyone must wear a face covering. Those without a face covering will be refused entry. Hand sanitizer will be set up at each entrance, and everyone must sanitize their hands before entering the building. Regarding the use of elevators, depending on size, only 1 or 2 people may ride in an elevator at the same time, and there will be signs outside of each elevator indicating how many persons are allowed in at the same time. However, in order to remain fit and also to encourage physical distancing, persons are encouraged to use the stairs. And to assist in physical distancing outside, there will be markers identifying breaks between 6 feet. Government officials will be located at doors, and there will be signs at the front of each building to let you know what you should do and shouldn't do while in the building. Earlier today, discussions were held with our union partners on the economic situation facing our country and how together we can act as our brothers and sisters keepers and do our part to save jobs, help those in need, and to save taxpayer dollars. Within government, we have already identified $65 million in taxpayer savings and are working collaboratively with our union partners, and we expect to find even more. These talks were fruitful, and I'm convinced that we understand the need to find solutions that will benefit all. Yet, as we look to our public officers for sacrifice and solutions, all too often social commentators look solely to them to bear the burden of sacrifice, while those who can afford to sacrifice are rarely asked to do so. Our public officers have often been scapegoated, abused, and disrespected, and portrayed as the source and solution to most of our problems. The government certainly does not accept that. In fact, we reject that mindset entirely. We know the sacrifices they make and the tireless work that many of them have performed, especially in the last few months as this country has battled this pandemic. As we are in this together, sacrifice will be discussed with all, worked upon by all, and made by all, not just those at the lowest end of the economic scale and just not by public officers. It makes no sense to ask persons to take cuts to wages when people do not get cuts to interest rates or to their power bills. So to be clear, fairness is needed across the board, and this government will ensure that all are to be a part of the equation. As I close tonight, I want to focus on the people who did their part in the early days of Phase 1 to try to help our country move forward and closer to the next phase of reopening our country and our economy. If you serve on the front lines as a medical professional battling COVID-19 and caring for its victims, if you serve on the front lines of maintaining law and order, if you are helping to keep our people fed, or reopening your business, following the rules and ensuring people maintain their strict social distancing, or if you simply played by the rules, maintain your distance, and limited your gatherings or any gatherings of persons to 10 or less people, and only left your house when necessary. Thank you. You are the ones, despite the actions of a selfish few, who will help us all move towards a closer, normal return. Bermuda, we can get through this, and we have come too far together to fracture and crumble now. I know that there may have been a lot of pent-up frustration and energy after being inside of your homes for 4 weeks. However, it is important that as a country, we do better, we stand stronger, we hold each other accountable, and obey the law so together we can see our lives and our collective health improve. This is not forever, but the longer it takes for us to get our act together, the longer it will take for us to come out of this. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Good afternoon, all.
Owen.
Owen Johnson Barnes with the Royal Gazette. Mr. Premier, you just mentioned shared sacrifices after this conversation with the unions. Can you tell us what you mean by shared sacrifice? How will you get some of those higher earners to share with the burden?
Are you talking about higher earners within government?
Within the public as a whole, Bermuda as a whole.
I think that what is important is that we recognize that, and I think it's from the perspective of workers, and I think I was very clear in my statement. It's all well and good for persons to talk about pay cuts to public officers, and clearly the public service, we want to make sure that we remain solvent as a country. But it's very difficult to ask persons to take pay cuts when there may be other instances in the country where there are certain businesses who are not also sharing inside that sacrifice. So I was very clear. It's difficult to tell people to take a pay cut when banks' interest rates, for instance, in this country, were reduced by 0.5%, and the same bank in the Cayman Islands reduced their interest rates by 1.5%. I don't think that is right and proper. And as I have said on numerous occasions, if the private sector doesn't act in these particular instances, then the government may be forced to do so. And it's not so much a threat. It's a matter of how, as a country, we get through this unprecedented period together, keeping our social cohesion. And that means that everyone has to be at the table.
Now, of course, over the weekend we had a lot of people blowing off steam. In fact, some people blowing off perhaps too much steam. Do you think this could have been avoided somewhat if the introduction to Phase 1 had taken place not on the weekend, but instead in the middle of the week?
That's a possibility. In hindsight, it's 2020. The fact is that, as the Minister of National Security said, the police and the regiment were out making sure they did their best to enforce regulations. And even though we've seen maybe 5 pictures on social media, I think the vast majority of persons obeyed the rules and the law. And I think that's what's important to focus on. We always hear about the minority instead of the vast majority. And so my perspective is to make sure that we remind persons. And as I said, we'll do some considerations. If some tweaks are necessary to be made, we'll go ahead and make those particular tweaks. But I think the vast majority of this country is being responsible, and it's important for those persons who are being responsible to encourage those who may be less than being responsible. A lot of my friends heard my mouth this weekend, and I'm sure a lot of people, other friends, heard other people. It's very simple. To see people inside of groups where people are not wearing masks is the height of irresponsibility, especially as the Minister of Health has made it clear that there are so many asymptomatic carriers of this virus. So it is particularly important that if you cannot maintain your social distance, that you wear your mask and protect everyone else, and don't be around people who don't have masks, because that means you yourself are unprotected.
Now, over the next few months, we've had a lot of events that have been canceled. Obviously, it looks like more probably will be. But we have had some events which so far have not been canceled, Bermuda Carnival, for example, being one. If these event organizers do not cancel, and if this issue is not remedied, is this something that the government will crack down on and force the cancellation?
Well, I believe that there was notifications that were sent out by persons involved in Carnival that that event would not be taking place this particular year. Certainly that would fit under over any threshold of gathering of persons, and it's not something that would be allowed. But the information that I had to my knowledge is that, of course, it's not a government event, so it's not necessarily a government event for us to announce, such as the Bermuda Day marathon, the Bermuda Day parade, for us to cancel. But I think that communications have gone out from the band and others that this event will not be happening this year, and I think that's pure common sense at this time.
All right. Now, of course, over the weekend, we did hear news that a Bermuda firefighter had been tested positive, and there had been some quarantines. I'd like to know, first of all, how many firefighters have been quarantined, and how many have been brought in to supplement that figure? So, basically, how many firefighters we still have on the ground? I
will defer to the Minister of Health and the Minister of National Security.
There's one person that has, so let's just talk about this in this thing overall. At the weekend, there was a firefighter that is COVID positive. Immediately, the Bermuda Fire Service enacted their protocols. And so, in all of the uniformed services, they have a button that they press when someone is deemed to be COVID positive. They immediately closed down 2 fire stations. Yes? When the fire stations were closed, they immediately implemented some deep cleaning regimes to make sure that the fire services were covered. They then had all of the senior staff that were off duty, they were brought on duty to supplement the officers that were indeed sent home. And so the object of the enterprise was to ensure, number one, that the COVID positive gentleman and his family were being supported, and everyone in that matrix was being given support. The next incident was the next part of the strategy was to make sure that there was some deep cleaning taking place, and that was taking place. The third incident was to make sure that we have the proper amount of people in. I can tell you that over the weekend, the stations being closed down, operational readiness was not affected at all. And so everyone that came into the station, everyone that piled in, everyone that came on the Bermuda Fire Service are a band of brothers and sisters, and they all came together, and we saw that operational readiness was not affected at all. At present, there are 98 personnel who have been tested.
So, how many were in quarantine currently?
The individual that tested positive is currently in quarantine, as well as his family.
Thank you.
Good evening, Premier. Can you clarify? You said tomorrow you will meet with the cabinet to refine existing regulations. Are you referring to phase 1?
The regulations that are in place govern the current phase.
After.
The regulations which we're in govern the current phase which we're in. And if there's any discussions or thoughts of any tweaks to be made, those decisions are made at cabinet level. The cabinet meets it every Tuesday. Tomorrow is our cabinet meeting. We have a number of things on the agenda. We discussed COVID. We're going to be discussing an issue of providing persons emergency access to their private pensions. And there's a number of other matters that are on the agenda in preparation for the resumption of the House of Assembly on Friday.
Have there been discussions with insurance companies to, I would say, assist with those that are struggling to pay insurance for properties? Has anyone from the finance minister's office been in contact with insurance companies?
There has been contact that's been made with insurance companies. I'm uncertain when the Minister of Finance is due back at this podium, but he'll be certain to the answer to those questions. I'm sure will be before the end of the week, whether it be Wednesday and or Friday if we have a press conference that we slip out from the House Assembly for. But I think that there's been contact that's been made with a number of particular entities, whether they be telecommunications providers, utility providers, health insurance providers, property insurance providers, etc. So from that particular perspective, I'm happy to follow up with a direct query, or if you would like to follow up with a direct query to the Minister of Finance, hopefully we can get that answer for you.
Minister Fogel, you just stated, I think some $15 million has been paid for unemployment benefits, correct? Mm-hmm. What is the budget for this whole exercise? Are you aware?
The finance minister has the budget allocation in total for this exercise, so I don't want to misspeak and give a figure that is not in accord with what he has established as being the budget in total.
Okay, I guess I would have to ask the finance minister my next question. Just to the total number of people who have applied to date are?
Well, I can tell you that there have been over 12,000 applications. However, quite a few of them have been duplications, so we're we estimate approximately 9,000 persons have applied.
How many people still with outstanding has not been paid thus far? Because I know there's a few taxi drivers that fall outside of this whole scenario. They have tried relentlessly through email and phone to make contact with whomever, and they cannot seem to be getting any type of assistance.
Okay. Well, what I can say is that taxi drivers are eligible for the benefits. So not knowing specific circumstances of those persons' case, I cannot speak to it directly. But persons in general who up till now have not been successful in receiving payment, there are a myriad of reasons why, which is why in my brief I made it quite clear there are still some persons who fall in that category, that they reach out so that we can find out what peculiarities exist with their particular case so that we can fix that. And I will say that quite a few of them fall in the category of rejections at the bank level. And so whatever has to be fixed to align that, those are circumstances beyond our control, but we are working to remedy that as quickly as we can.
I'm not too sure who's going to. I'm addressing this too, but grocery stores. Are we still under the alphabetical order for the grocery stores? There was a scheme in place for 5% on a daily basis for shoppers. That has been dropped now, and only Marketplace has the 5% on Wednesdays. And there are seniors that are concerned that look for that 5%, and their dollars are being stretched, but their alphabetical, their last name doesn't fall within that bracket, especially for Wednesdays. What recourse do they have?
I'm not sure if that information is entirely correct, Trevor. As I understand it, during the first period of shelter in place, the grocery stores extended their discounts throughout the entire period. During the second period of shelter in place, those discounts were applicable on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday.
Okay. Jesus.
Good evening, Mr. Premier. You've addressed all the non-social distancing that took place this weekend when the shelter in place was lifted and how it could place people's health in danger. Could you also say something about how it's also affecting people's livelihoods, as it could delay phases 2 and 3 and prevent people from getting back to work and earning an income?
Well, absolutely, Don, and thank you for your question. It's not just about affecting people's livelihoods. It's about affecting the health of the country as well. And I think that it's very key, because certainly we want to make sure that we're at a stable level. If it comes to moving to phase 2 or phase 3, we don't want to have a number of increasing infections. We want infections to be going down. We don't want to have increasing hospitalizations. We want those things to be stable or to be going down. So that's something that is certainly going to be necessary and needed if we look to move forward to these future phases. But yes, you are absolutely correct. And that's why I close my remarks and comments by saying that if we do not maintain our unity, if we do not recognize that it requires all of us to follow the rules, then this will be harder and more difficult for the entire country as we go forward. So in this particular case and instance, we have upgraded our testing capacity. We're able to detect. We have more things that will be coming online, such as the technology solutions to assist. But it is the most important thing is for people to maintain their distance, wear a mask, don't gather in large groups, and only go out when you have to. And if we follow those particular things, we'll be just fine. Well, challenge will happen is if we don't.
With regard to the announcement of phase 1, it seems like many people this weekend simply saw it as a green light to get together with others and ignore social distancing. How do you think the messaging could have been stronger or clearer? And also, could the beaches and parks have been patrolled more stringently?
I'll defer the matter of the beaches and parks to the Minister of National Security, but I'm going to start by answering your question by saying that I disagree with the premise, because I don't believe that it was many. I believe that in the era of which we live in, that social media will allow us to magnify a few particular cases and instances and to portray it as the norm. I went out myself for a drive just to see, because all the hubbub and noise. So I left my house on Saturday and I left my house on Sunday, and I went to go and took a drive around to a number of places. And every single store that I went by, exception of one, which I went ahead and wrote in, was maintaining social distance with persons outside. At the place of where we went to patronize a local establishment and picked up some food for our family to eat. Persons were lined up outside, they were masked, they were maintaining their social distancing. So I think the vast majority of persons in cases were actually doing it. So I do not accept the premise that it was many. Yes, there were more than we would have liked, but I think that if we all just go ahead and remember that this is something that we have to be in for the long haul. Nobody wants to go back to a place where we're locked in each other's houses. I think that we'll be in a better space. And let the minister answer the question regarding the patrols.
I think that the Bermuda Police Service and the Royal Bermuda Regiment had an adequate response over the weekend. As the Premier said, the behavior was hyper-magnified by social media, and we have to hold those that broke the rules, we have to hold them accountable. The reality of it is that there were over 40, there were a number of police officers and Bermuda Regiment soldiers on patrol. There were over 891 interactions with different people. Whilst we don't have a specific breakdown for beaches, and the police and the Bermuda Regiment were out in numbers. I think what we have to do, though, is that we have to hold people accountable for bad behavior. And it is an opportunity for us now to reinforce the message, to highlight the guidelines as we did tonight, and make sure that people understand that it is their behavior that we must hold to account. Again, $10,000 fine or 6 months imprisonment, that is hefty. And so if you have police officers that are going to the beach, if two people are standing too close together, are they going to put them in court? Are they going to get that fine? So we want to control behavior as opposed to throwing the law at everyone. And we want to make sure that people are behaving. And in a last resort, we would like to, put people before the courts. But let's be clear, yes, that the police do have, and the regiment, they are going to be out on patrol, but we're appealing to the sensibility of our brothers and sisters to make sure that they socially distance themselves from each other and that they are out at appropriate times, and that businesses are ensuring that if you have a restaurant and people are there, it is your responsibility to make sure that you have a security guard there, that the parking lot is being adequately policed, that there is the proper cleaning equipment and hand sanitizing equipment. This is something that we all have to do to make sure that we are covering all of our bases in conjunction and keeping in line with the legislation.
Thank you. The Bermuda public went through 1 month of suffering with shelter in place, not to mention the huge economic losses. We are seeing that some people are now not abiding by the social distancing guidance, and the National Security Minister is threatening another SIP order on social media. Why hasn't the government implemented a tracking app during this pandemic, such as been seen like in Taiwan, South Korea, and China, that people have to keep with them when they're out?
Firstly, I never use the term "you're going back to shelter in place," but let's be clear. What we were saying that if we continue to go down this road, we'll have to make other considerations, yes? And that was said on social media as well as in a video vlog. But the ethos is behind it. And I'll say it again. We're not trying to threaten anyone. We're simply saying that we need people to act responsibly. And that is something for all of us to do when we are out in public.
Regarding a tracking app, we're not China.
Okay. You have a cabinet meeting tomorrow. Would you consider allowing restaurants to sell alcohol with their takeout orders? Many are in a desperate state after being closed for a month and are looking for a boost to increase revenue. And this has been tried successfully in other jurisdictions like California, New York, and Ontario.
This is a question that has been asked to us on a number of occasions. It's something that was put forward by the Chamber of Commerce. It's something that was considered. And the government has declined that particular request. And it's not because we do not value the bartenders that they work inside of these various establishments, et cetera, but we also have to recognize that there's also other small business owners and persons who own liquor stores and other who are also hurting. And so at this particular point in time, it's not something that we're inclined to do. In future phases, maybe, but right now it's not something that we're inclined to do. And though that request has been made, it's not something the government is going to take on board at this time.
And lastly tonight, you mentioned about people being able to dip into their pension fund. Last November, you were talking about bringing that money that's overseas back on island. How do you see this as a double-edged boost for the economy?
Well, I think that in times of crisis, and the Minister of Finance and I had a conversation about this today after our meeting with the unions, but in times of crisis, you have to make extraordinary decisions and thoughts. What we will have is a massive demand shock inside of our economy. Pensions are not made for use at any point in time. They're for savings for our retirement. But what we have to recognize that in Bermuda in 2020, we're in a far different place of where we were maybe even 20 years ago when these private pensions just started up. There is a large amount of savings, and persons who have access to this money, should not wait until they're 65 in order to access it in some cases and instances. Because just be clear, if you are in poverty, if you are hurting now, you're going to reduce your life expectancy, and that's what we're making sure that we do our best to try to avoid. So it's something that we've seen in a number of jurisdictions around the world. It's something of which we were always going to make sure that we put in place here. It was one of our earliest considerations. It was something that we were always going to plan to do, and we plan on tabling that legislation in Friday in the House. And one of my to-do list items is to have a conversation. I haven't spoken to the Leader of the Opposition yet today, but to have a conversation later to figure out whether or not we can be on the same page with this particular issue and move this thing through first, second, and third readings on Friday sitting in the House of Assembly so that we can go ahead and move this over to the Senate and get it enacted into law to allow persons to go ahead and make those particular emergency withdrawals versus waiting for us another 2 weeks when the House comes back on the 22nd of May. So it is something that is important regarding bringing money back. The Minister of Finance had, if you would have listened to his Facebook Live on Saturday, he explained a number of options of which he's looking at regarding pensions, including some of the things of which we had said regarding to start up your own business or to purchase particular assets, such as housing, first-time home ownership, etc. So those are all things of which the Minister of Finance is considering. Will those all be ready for us to sit in the House of Assembly on Friday? Probably not. But the one part which will be ready will be the one-time emergency withdrawal, and we're going to look to go ahead and get that through to provide additional relief, not only to persons in the who may have these private sector pensions and may want to have access to them, but also to provide an option for small business owners as well to have access to some relief.
Just to refine that just slightly, because I know, like you were talking about how this money's overseas working for another country rather than having it here working for us. You were talking about, I believe, like for banks or cooperative grocery stores or other little small businesses. So with it now, this being a prime time to do that, to get that money from overseas here, how much more important do you think it is?
I'm not sure if it's more important, yes or no. I mean, the fact is that it's something that we're going to do as a broad package of measures to make sure that we can effectively respond and make sure our economy is strong into the future.
All right. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Aaron Hill on behalf of Bird News. Mr. Premier, we've been extremely pleased to hear you proudly applaud the contributions of some of the young Bermudians who have assisted this government with their expertise during this pandemic crisis. Specifically, you have praised the assistance of young Bermudian professionals Dr. Karika Weldon, Dr. Kevin Miners, and health economist Mr. Aaron Evans. My question to you, Mr. Premier, is are these young Bermudians being paid for their hard work and valuable contributions?
I think we've answered the questions regarding Dr. Weldon. I'm uncertain if Dr. Miners or Mr. Evans have asked for compensation. They were brought to us by Dr. Weldon to go through that, so I'm uncertain, to be completely honest.
Mr. Premier, this is one question that was curious to me as someone who's completing their legal bar course. Our Wills Act, 1988, which would deal with our disposition of assets during times of death, it requires that all wills are executed in writing and in the presence of the testator. Given that hospital visits are restricted and visits to rest homes have been restricted, there are obvious impediments to executing wills in the presence of a testator. Bearing this in mind, will the government consider amending the Wills Act to allow for wills to be executed in alternative forms, for example, by virtual recordings?
I'm going to defer to a former Attorney General who's sitting at the table.
Thanks, Aaron. That's a very good question, and it's certainly something that we can consider. To my knowledge, with BHB falling under me, there hasn't been an issue with respect to them, anybody trying to have wills executed by patients that are in the BHB, but it's certainly something we can consider.
Thank you. Mr. Premier, a recent article highlighted some of the potential difficulties in the food supply chain. For example, we saw one of our major grocery chains indicate that some of their major distributors had been shut down and they've had to seek alternatives, which would inevitably, in this wholesaler or grocer's words, increase the food price. In light of this, what steps have the government taken to ensure continued food security in the event that supply links are interrupted?
Thank you, Aaron. It's a question that's been asked a number of times before. The Deputy Premier is in close communication with the food suppliers and importers. Also, that information is fed into the EMO under Minister Keynes' remit. It's something that we ask about on a regular occasion. Though there have been some supply disruptions, it's interesting to note that the supply disruptions are considered temporary at this point in time, and they do have backup plans that have been in place. So there certainly are some supply challenges, but I think that it also provides an opportunity, as I think I've said on previous occasions, that we need to make sure that we invest more in our domestic food production. And that is one of the things that I've charged the Deputy Premier to make sure that he focuses on during this time, because it is important.
Thank you. In March, this government issued guidance regarding landlord and tenant disputes. Tonight, we've heard you repeat that guidance. Given that the government guidelines are non-binding and landlords and many individuals, rather, are still finding themselves unable to pay their rent, and recognizing that the government unemployment benefit provides only a maximum of $500 per week, and individuals are only able to apply for financial assistance after 12 weeks of receiving the unemployment benefit, is this government opposed to legislating debt forgiveness program or providing alternatives like a rent relief program for Bermudians struggling to pay their rent?
You said, is this, I'll answer the base of the question in which you asked at the end, and you said, is this government opposed? This government is not opposed to anything. We are going to try to find the solutions which work and which work well. The fact is that in many instances, these things have worked well. In instances where there are persons who may have been acting outside, they've either contacted my office or they've contacted a local MP, and we've actually been able to sort out those problems.
Grateful. Tonight you've said in times of crisis, extraordinary decisions are required. Again, we hear about guidelines and such. What are some of the extraordinary decisions that this government plans to make with respect to amending laws to ensure that we stimulate this economy?
I think that if you take just a plain and simple basic look, if you're giving people access to their pension funds that are not supposed to be there for their retirement, that is an extraordinary measure, and it's something in which you're doing to make sure that you can support economic activity. It's not something that anyone wants to touch. It's not something that is there to be touched in any way, shape, or form, but that is something, I think, which will fall into that category of extraordinary because we are in extraordinary times. I mean, if we want to go on as far as say extraordinary, I think it's extraordinary to say that we declare a state of emergency. It's extraordinary to say that we're going to, put in place and restrictions on people's movement. Those are the types of things, but it is extraordinary times, and those are the things which we have to do. I mean, it's extraordinary that this government has created an unemployment benefit overnight, basically, to make sure that we can provide support for persons inside of the community. It's extraordinary that we put $12 billion to make sure that we can prop up small businesses to make sure that they can actually have cash flow and survive and to be able to continue to maintain some of the benefits to their employees. So I think there's a number of things which we've done which would never consider in normal times. But as I think we all know, this is not a normal time.
Again, on the topic of extraordinary decisions, would this government be considering things like a corporation tax and a tax on some of the wealthy in Bermuda to increase the percentage that they pay?
At this point in time, I don't know if that's what the Minister of Finance is thinking, but here's what I can say. The Minister of Finance was very clear in saying that everything is on the table. And I think the Minister of Finance, through his Economic Advisory Council, through his discussion with the unions and others, has said that we have to consider all options. This is not a normal time. There are some people who want to advocate for that. There are many different things that can happen, yes or no. But I think what is important to recognize is that from the Minister of Finance's perspective, he has said that all things are on the table, and I'm not going to question him as to whether or not he's serious on that matter.
Grateful.
Good evening, everyone. My first question, Premier, you mentioned earlier in your statement that certain businesses did not adhere to the regulations at the very beginning of your statement. So my question to Minister Keynes would be, how many businesses did not adhere to regulations over the weekend, and how many businesses, if any, were shut down?
No business. I don't have the number of businesses that did not follow the regulations. When the Bermuda Police Service or the Bermuda Regiment go to a business, in the first instance, they're not going to shut it down. So if you go to a business and people are not socially distanced, the exercise or the enterprise is to make sure that they simply tweak and make sure that people get in the right place. So if every time you go to a business, right, you go in, you shut it down, you arrest people, you lock them up, we're in this for the long haul. This is our community. We want to make sure that enforcement is strong, you have the legislation, you have the potential to have people be incarcerated for up to 6 months and a $10,000 fine. That is the stick. But in the same instance, when you go to a business and people are crunched together, you simply don't shut it down. You give them guidance and you make sure that they're following the rules. Then they go back an hour later. You go back 2 hours later or the next day to see if they're indeed following it. We're in the early stages. We saw people badly behaved at the weekend. We believe that was a small number of people. We have the Bermuda Police Service and the Bermuda Regiment going out policing, and we're going to measure it. We're going to make sure that they're looking at enforcement. If the need comes where people have to have businesses shut down, we will do it. But that is not what we're out here for. And we will make sure that people follow the rule. But in the first instance, we're just going to make sure that people adjust their positions, make sure they're following the rules, and make sure they're following the regulations.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
My next question goes to Minister Fogo. There's a question about some of the college students who come back home and then they have work and they try to get money to pay for schooling again. For those students who aren't under any social insurance or any contracts with their jobs because they're under it as a student, is there any chance for them to be able to get any payment through the unemployment fund?
Based on the way in which those regulations are set up, I would have to say at this point in time, no. However, I can tell you the Department of Workforce Development, the Ministry of Labor, is looking at summer students to see whether or not it is something that we can uphold, and further looking to see how best we can assist persons who fall in that category.
Who can they contact to help with that assistance?
Say that again.
Who can those students contact to help with that assistance?
Workforce Development.
Workforce
the
Development.
offices at Workforce Development.
Okay. Thank you. And also a question for you again. With the level of high volume calls and emails that you spoke about earlier, is there any thought to have some job positions opening to help with assisting with that?
Well, we have, I guess if you will, hired a call center. A center is set up that routes one call from one person to the next to the next. I think the only thing that happens now is that if someone doesn't answer, if all persons are engaged, people get timed out and they fall off. And I think that's where some of, I guess if you will, the angst arises for persons who don't successfully get through. And that is what we're telling people, to keep calling back, because as you can see, the volume of calls, we have to, when we get that person on the line, we have to try and assist them with their issue. And so we're looking every day to see how we can make that more efficient. But I can say this, that we are, let's say if you get about 400 calls, 300 of those calls, hands down, get answered, period. So so if it moves up to about 600, what we have noticed is that on average, we are successful with at least 75 to 80% of those calls. And so those persons who are not successful with getting through because the calls are coming all day, every day, we keep telling people to keep calling back. And it may be frustrating, and I apologize for that, but we are trying to service everyone. And as has been stated both by the Premier and through my statement, we will assist all of those persons who are eligible for the benefit. So keep calling. That is my answer to persons.
Thank you. And the follow-up to that would be, do you believe that increasing staff could help with, answering all of them at one time, like 100% instead of that 80?
Say that again.
Would you believe that increasing the staff would help to answer 100% instead
Well,
of
we
that
did
80?
increase the staff because we had fewer staff before, and we did increase the staff. And so it has helped us to answer even more calls. And so I think what really happens, depending on the issue, some issues with the persons we are assisting require more attention than others. So it is a balancing act, but even on the floor for those persons who are in-house, when more are needed to mend the phones, if you will, then we use those persons too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And my final question for you, Minister Keynes. The panel spoke a lot about not wanting to, arrest people and not wanting to fine people, which is obviously good for the people because it's not what you're out here to do, and we understand that fully. So my question would be, would you consider maybe having minor, smaller fines put in place instead of those major, heavy ones for the small people that don't adhere to the regulations in a small matter?
Maya, that's actually really thoughtful of you. We were looking at, and I'm going to be sharing it with my colleagues. I have to. The police commissioner and a couple of my colleagues brought up in the EMO this morning the opportunity for us to look at fixed penalties, i.e. like they do in Cayman Islands. So it's a fine system, like if you get a speeding ticket. And so this is something that we need to discuss. We need to put together a paper on it and discuss with the Attorney General and bring it. And so my PS is looking at an opportunity for us to look at fixed penalties, right? Where you get it, where they can write a ticket and give it to you, as opposed to having to go to court and having, you have to go to court ultimately because that's a part of the process if you choose to plead not guilty. But looking at doing something differently with fixed penalty fines on the spot, police officers able to write tickets.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
That's it. Okay. And we're right at 7 o'clock. With that, just before I close, I would like to say that the Minister of National Security has informed me that there will be a meeting of the clergy at 4 p.m. on Thursday, and his office will be sending out the details. That was something that we promised that we would hold this week. And in closing, I do want to send out two notes of condolence. The first note of condolence that I will send is to the family of the broadcasting pioneer in Bermuda, Mr. Montague Shepard, who passed away. And I also want to send a note of condolence to a member of my family, and that's Uncle George, who lost his wife of 62 years earlier today. Condolences to you, Uncle George, and blessings to you. Good night, everyone.